And the movement is all drugs legal and an anti-abstinence movement. And I say this with a great deal of concern because I have met professionals, physicians and others who are promoting the thought that you can use drugs, but not in a hazardous way. Even the medical community and some members of the scientific community are beginning to advocate the idea that abstinence is an unrealistic goal amongst people who've had problems or have had substance use disorders. And so what I will try to summarize very quickly, I talk very slowly, unfortunately. That's part of the habit of being a scientist and an educator. You learn to speak slowly because sometimes the concepts are difficult, but then it gets very pedantic and very boring for others. What I will do is talk about changing your mind, marijuana in the brain. From 1900 onwards, most accidental deaths in the United States declined. Deaths due to falls, deaths due to fires, deaths due to drownings, deaths due to vapors and poison gases, with one exception. Deaths due to drugs have risen dramatically over the past few decades. And for the first time in our history, in the past 3 decades, the past 3 years, our life expectancy has not risen. It has dropped. And it has dropped primarily because of deaths due to drugs. So today we will get a quick overview of marijuana. How does marijuana affect the brain? The adolescent brain and marijuana, and opioids and marijuana. Will marijuana solve the opioid crisis? Many people say to you, young people, advocates for marijuana, that it's only a plant. But plants can be toxic. There are 300,000 different species of plants in the world, and we use far less than 10% of them. In fact, we don't even use 20,000. We generally use somewhere between 200 to 500 plants, depending on location. And the reason is that plants produce toxins in order to protect themselves from insects, from a number of other predators that will eat them. They don't have fists, they don't have teeth, they don't have legs to run away. And so the beautiful oleander plant or the strychnine plant are deadly. And there are thousands, the vast majority of plants are deadly. And some of them are deadly because they interfere with the nervous system of the brain. A caterpillar, hungry, recently developed, is given access to tomato leaves, which they love. They'll eat the leaves and go their merry way. You spray the same leaf with cocaine, and what happens is, within no time at all, their nervous system is paralyzed and they cannot function, and some of them die. Same experiment has been done with marijuana. These are an example of the hundreds of plants that are toxins. So, first and foremost, when people say it's natural, refute them by saying, no, it's not, because most plants are toxic, especially ones that interfere with brain communication. Now, what is marijuana? Is it a pure compound? It contains about 700 chemicals, about 104 are made by the plant. There are thousands made by chemists now, currently, and they're endocannabinoids made by the brain and by the body. What we've seen in the past few years is that marijuana, which used to be 1 to 3%, if you could advance, please. If you could advance. Right now, the concentration of marijuana is hovering at about 18% in a number of samples garnered from Europe and the United States. And concentrates of marijuana now have approximately 50 to 80% THC. So what are the implications for driving, for addiction, for toxicity, and for psychosis? In every single one of these categories, there is now evidence that the more potent the marijuana, the more risks there are for driving, addiction, toxicity, and psychosis. And as I've said, I'm very concerned about smoking and vaping, because adolescents use Juuls for curiosity, for recreational use. They believe vaping is healthier than smoking. They can disguise it from parents and teachers. It's odor-free. And yet, if adolescents use vapes, they are much more likely to develop an addiction to marijuana and also to tobacco. If youth use marijuana, they're much more likely to smoke, to binge alcohol, to use alcohol heavily, and to use illicit drugs. If youth use marijuana, their opioid use is approximately 10 times higher, and they're much more likely to show signs of depression. And it depends on how much they use. The more they use, the more the symptoms. The same is true for 18 to 25-year-olds. They are more likely to use opioids and more likely to show signs of depression. So how does marijuana affect the brain? What does it do to the brain? The endocannabinoid system is an ancient system. It's present in many animals throughout the kingdom of animals. It has two major branches, which are called the branches related to the CB1 receptors that are found in the brain, in the heart, the pancreas, muscle, reproductive organs, vascular tissue, and the CB2 receptor, which is found primarily in blood cells and immune cells, the brain, heart, adrenal, and so on. Why do I tell you this? Why is this important? It's important because the advocates for medical marijuana have claimed that marijuana can treat almost every ailment of every one of these organs because the endocannabinoid system is there. It is part of what I call the fast and loose science of simply combining, well, it will affect the immune system. We have a few studies done in cell culture, therefore it's a cure for immunosuppression. Or we have a few studies done in cultured organs, and therefore it's a cure for cancer. So endocannabinoids are critical. They regulate how your brain thinks, they regulate how you sleep, they regulate your energy metabolism and inflammation. But marijuana influences this, and how does it do so? Here's a primer on brain communication. Person talks to another person. They will say, take a selfie, happy birthday, thanks, come closer. So there is a transmitter of the message, there's a receiver of the message, and there's the message itself. How does the brain communicate? It does exactly the same thing. It begins to transmit chemicals from one nerve cell to another. Those chemicals are received and they are interpreted. And what happens with marijuana? Marijuana resembles the natural chemical messages of the brain. It enters the communication system and it literally floods the entire brain with chemical messages in places that are not supposed to be, for duration, for time sequences that are not supposed to be. And by doing so, it interrupts brain communication very profoundly. The immediate effects of marijuana on the brain is that marijuana, THC is an imposter of the brain's messengers to arachidonyl glycerol and anandamide. Cannabinoids disrupt normal communication. The abnormal signals produce euphoria. That's what attracts people to the drug. But the signals are much more intense and last longer than normal signals because a slight difference in the chemical can produce a vast change with regard to signaling. So marijuana causes the brain to adapt. I won't get into all the different forms of adaptation, but acute exposure causes a set of changes in the chemistry of the brain, in the structure of the brain, in the function of the brain, and long-term, with repeated use, more and more centers in the brain are recruited and they adapt. And once that adaptation takes place, the brain no longer feels quite normal without the introduction of marijuana into it. And that's one of the heart and soul secrets of addictive drugs. The brain has changed to an extent that you no longer feel quite as good or even better than without the drug. So repeated marijuana use changes brain signaling, cell biology, structure, brain circuits. It alters reward, thinking, judgment, life goals, and needs. And what about the developing adolescent brain? In adolescence, the cannabinoid signaling system is critical for brain development. It guides the formation of circuits. It forms connections between the cells. And what we are beginning to understand now is that introducing a false transmitter, an imposter, into this very delicately orchestrated process of brain development can change the brain in ways that are totally compromising to the young adolescent. This is the first study that's just came out of the ABCD study, which is a longitudinal study of adolescent brain cognitive development sponsored by the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And what it shows is that mothers who use marijuana, if they use it during pregnancy, their children are more likely to have symptoms associated with psychosis as they grow older. It's a small number of people, but it's alarming. We know that many brain disorders start in adolescence: impulse control, substance use, anxiety, mood disorders, and schizophrenia. And the reason is that the adolescent brain is rapidly growing. It's pruning connections, it's strengthening connections. It's, in fact, the gray matter, the gray cells are shrinking, and it changes regionally. It's critical to prune these connections because some of them are unnecessary and they muddy quick and thoughtful responses to issues. And the study just came out in March of this year with a large consortium showing that the marijuana use only a few times by adolescents can give rise to an enlarged regions of the brain. And the authors, this was a multi-center study with multiple authors, were puzzled by why would the brain get bigger? Does that mean it's better? No, because what it reflects is that this pruning process may be interfered with by the introduction of marijuana during adolescence, so that the brain, in fact, is larger than it should be at a comparable time. And when they did neuropsychological testing on these kids who'd only used it a few times, their testing was compromised compared with young people who had never used. The brain, the teen brain also strengthens connections. It insulates the wires so that the transmission of information can go much faster. And it also reorganizes brain circuits. So different parts of the brain are used by adolescents differently than the adult. What the teen brain is susceptible to with marijuana use are brain changes, as I've alluded to, addiction, deficits in thinking, in learning, and memory, amotivation, psychiatric diseases, safety, and also sleep. There are 46 studies that have been done on brain imaging, of which a number of them have been done with adolescents showing that their brains are different amongst the marijuana users than those who've not used marijuana. And some of these changes have been measured with function, with thinking, with learning and memory, and shown to correlate with them. What about addiction? This study came out, first authored by Beth Hong very recently, and very few people picked this up. The press didn't pick it up. It seems that it's not hit any radar screens, but I consider this one of the most compelling findings I have heard. That if young people, aged 12 to 17, use marijuana heavily, within the first year, 10.9% will become addicted. And each year they continue to use heavily, the percentage who will become addicted increases. And if they use heavily unto the fourth year, the percent addiction is 20.6%. 1 in 5 teenagers will have a cannabis or marijuana use disorder within 4 years of initiation of heavy use. And if you compare that to adults, it's much lower. They start at about half, and they remain about half if they initiate marijuana use at a later age, 18 to 25, which means protecting young people from marijuana is absolutely critical. What about cognition and motivation? Marijuana can affect learning and memory. It can impair motor function. It can impair decision making. And how does that translate into the real world? Well, persistent marijuana addiction is associated with about an 8-point loss in IQ if use persists until at least the age of 38. It affects adult motivation as a function of how many uses, 400 plus. Young people who start using, if they use heavily and frequently, they are much less likely to get a bachelor's degree from college. They are much more likely to be unemployed and on welfare. What about mental health? We've heard so much about mental health ever since Alex Berenson's book has come out. But so much of the data has been with us since the 1980s. Slides that I made for talks in the 1990s, the 2000s, I always talked about psychosis as one of my biggest worries, but nobody cared until a wonderful, very eloquent writer put it into a book that was approachable by others. And what are the risks? If marijuana is used before age 17, by the time a person is 30, they are much more likely to be dependent on marijuana. They are much more likely to use other drugs, and they are more likely to attempt suicide. And all of it depends on how frequently they use, less than monthly or weekly. What about psychosis and schizophrenia? We hear about psychosis, we hear about schizophrenia. Few of us have had an encounter with any of these, and so it's important to define them. I know this field close up. Suspiciousness, paranoia, thinking that people are plotting against you, that the FBI is transmitting messages through the fillings in your teeth, bizarre thoughts and delusions. I can go swimming in my iPhone. I can fly. I can jump off an airplane without a parachute, and I know that I will land. Those are very simplistic ones. They're far more complex. Conceptual disorganization, fragmented thoughts, sentences that don't make sense, and then hallucinations of a nature that you could hear or see or feel that aren't there at all to anyone else. Next, please. So, psychosis can happen without schizophrenia. These are the positive signs of schizophrenia. Psychosis can happen if you have a drug toxicity. It can happen if you have a metabolic disease. It can happen if you have dementia. There are many, many ways to get to this endpoint of psychosis. But schizophrenia is a long-term debilitating disease that is characterized by those symptoms as well as negative symptoms. Apathy, strange emotional responses to others, demotivation in many cases. And we hear constantly debate, is it correlation or is it causation? Does marijuana cause psychosis and schizophrenia, or is it simply correlated? Are people using marijuana to alleviate, to lift the burden of psychosis from their brains or schizophrenia? So what are the criteria for causation? What about psychosis and schizophrenia? And what about marijuana and psychosis? Let's very simply talk about correlation. In the summertime, it's hot. Phoenix is about 105 today. It will be 110 tomorrow. And the sun blazes. And then blessed relief comes and it's covered with 120 inches of snow. Hope, wishful thinking, of course. And then the sun rises again and becomes blazing hot. Now, many people use watermelon during the hottest months of the summer, and in the cool months they don't, and watermelon sales decline. At the same time, many wars are begun in the summertime, and during the winter, people rarely continue a war, or if they do, they're foolish enough, like Napoleon and Hitler, to invade Russia during the Russian winter. And many people have heart attacks during the summer, more so than in the winter. Now, would you say that watermelon causes wars? And does watermelon cause heart disease? How many say yes? And if you say yes, please leave the room. Because of course not. Wars are started this summer because the climate is much more favorable for marching long distances. And heart attacks occur more frequently because the heat brings out people who exercise, sometimes too vigorously, for the heart that they are endowed with. So that's what correlation means. One has nothing to do with the other. But what about causation? What are the criteria? There has to be a strong association. The larger, the better. There has to be consistency. Findings in different places, different samples, different countries, different cities. There has to be timing. One has to precede the other. There has to be a dose response. The more you're exposed, the stronger the relationship. There has to be specificity, a specific population with no other likely explanation. And there has to be some biological plausibility, which means that somehow you can relate one to the other. This is a very key, these are 6, there are about 8 that have been documented, but many people subscribe to these 6. So, the attributed cause of admission to a Bengal insane asylum in 1873 to 1893, long before we had marijuana industry, long before we had the politics of marijuana, long before we had good science, we found in the India Hemp Report that the vast majority of people who occupied an insane asylum due to drugs, between 25 and 40% were due to marijuana. Alcohol had a much lower rate of inducing the psychosis that required admission. In those days, it was a politically incorrect term, an insane asylum, and opioids were lower still. Marta DeForti in London did a very, very clever study in which she gauged the potency of marijuana in different cities available with the presence of psychotic disorders and frequency of use. And in London, she found the more people use, the more potent they use, the higher the level of psychotic disorders. In Amsterdam, the risks for high potent THC used daily was 9-fold higher, 900% greater. In London, it was about 5-fold, or 500%. And in Paris, very similar to London. So here is a strength of association with strength, how much you use. Consider timing. And marijuana use precedes psychosis. And in young people, the more you use, the more preclinical symptoms of psychosis you have, including bizarre thoughts, paranoia, hallucinations, subclinical psychosis. The longer adolescents use marijuana, and marijuana precedes the symptoms, because if they never use, their symptoms are very low. The greater the risk for psychosis, and use precedes the symptoms. So timing is right, and timing has been shown in a number of other studies. Now, what about specificity? This is a fantastically interesting study that came out very recently. These are people who enter into an emergency department with psychosis due to marijuana or to other drugs, to alcohol, to sedatives, to opiates, to cocaine, to hallucinogens. And what these people did was follow their medical records, and they found that a half of the people who use marijuana convert to psychosis within 3 years. And by 20 years, the percent that converts is about 47%, which is dramatic. The highest risk of all these drugs was marijuana, the lower the risk alcohol, and lower risk for other drugs. The greatest risk was young people using between 16 and 25. Biological plausibility. THC induces psychosis in otherwise normal people. If you give them an antipsychotic drug that works with schizophrenia, it's called a D2 dopamine receptor blocker, you find that the symptoms diminish greatly. It produces, THC produces suspiciousness, paranoia, grandiose delusions, conceptual disorganization, fragmented thinking, and antipsychotics will work as a fun. And these are all the studies that have shown giving THC to otherwise normal people induces psychosis. So let's talk about causality versus association without making a final judgment. The strength of association, 2 to 9-fold risk by using. The consistency in different places, different populations show similar outcomes. We can now say India, Brazil, many countries in Europe. The timing, marijuana use generally precedes psychosis in prospective teen studies. The dose response, the heavier the use, increases the risk and the symptoms. The biological plausibility. Marijuana users have an earlier age of onset of schizophrenia. They often quit to avoid the symptoms. It induces psychosis in otherwise healthy people and exacerbates them. And these are some of the references in the scientific literature to support this. So let's see where we stand. Heavy marijuana use has enormous risks for young people in terms of brain changes, addiction, cognitive deficits, amotivation, psychosis, safety, and sleep. I haven't gone into safety or sleep, but I summarize these by calling it the BAD apps, BAD-APS. It's very simple to remember. Is marijuana a solution to the opioid crisis? We've heard unfathomably, unbelievably that some governors are taking the step to say that marijuana should be an indication for the opioid crisis without the evidence. What is the problem with substituting marijuana for opioids? There are no clinical trials that are really valid to substitute one for the other. The studies that show it reduces deaths are deeply flawed. Many factors affect opioid overdose deaths. Substituting marijuana for opioids is potentially harmful, and the recommendations don't meet the high standards. Is marijuana effective for treating? No, the evidence is so weak because no prospective studies have looked for it. Do users of marijuana for pain use fewer opioids? They use more opioids and pain is not reduced if they use marijuana. Marijuana doesn't provide relief for chronic pain. 70% reported to have no effect on opioid use. People who use opioids are using marijuana daily. It's less likely to reduce morphine. They have greater pain severity in self-reports, greater anxiety, and so on and so forth. So my summary conclusion is, and these are two studies, one just came out, one came out just a little while ago, showing in states that legalize or medicalize marijuana, opioid overdose deaths, in fact, were higher than the states that have not. So from my perspective, the public policy for substituting marijuana symbolizes a disrespect for people with pain and opioid use disorder. You would never, never recommend that a person be treated with diabetes with some ointment because somebody tells you so without evidence in the literature. There are no clinical trials that prove benefit. No other disease is treated without solid evidence. Patients in pain are the most vulnerable and stigmatized, and I think you add to the disrespect by giving them a treatment that has no scientific evidence whatsoever except self-reports and belief system. It's irresponsible public policy. And medical professions in the past used to recommend one drug to treat another, and we know that that happened when cocaine was used to treat morphine in the 19th century. Bob DuPont will know that history very well. So we should hold any treatment for opioid use disorder to the same medical standards we have for every other disease. FDA-approved medications are well studied. They have national standards prescribed by clinicians. There's quality evidence required. Products are regulated in terms of dose and purity. We saw this with Epidiolex, cannabidiol, for use in seizure disorders, where they went through all the gruesome, brutal, daunting FDA approval process, and the evidence clearly said it is worth testing this drug in young children with intractable seizure disorders. But with marijuana, whole plant marijuana, 80%, 10% dabs, smokes, vapors, brownies, liquids, we have no comparable evidence. They're recommended by bud tenders, not by physicians, and they're unregulated in all sorts of forms. So from my perspective, without convincing evidence, it's irresponsible and could make the problem worse. And I'd like to close with a very simple thought. I've gone through a number of reasons and a number of ways in which marijuana affects the adolescent brain. It also affects the adult brain. It compromises your brain's ability to think, to plan, to be motivated. It can invoke addiction in adolescents especially, but also in adults. It compromises safety. It compromises sleep. It can lower IQ. It can lead to far less achievement within the potential of each individual person. In many ways, it compromises our humanity. That's what it does. And our brain is the repository of our humanity. It is where we are able to either create poetry or enjoy it, create calculus or use it to construct airplanes, create iPhones or enjoy the instant connection to friends and family. It's where we create a system of laws that enable us to live in harmony with one another and to have judgment upon us if we don't. It is all this that comes from our brain. And when our brain is compromised, so is our humanity. So I don't call this a war on drugs. I call this a defense of our humanity, which resides in our brain. Thank you very much. In this world, globally, we have a problem. We have a problem because nations are at a crossroads with regard to drug policy. The United States is, a number of states are, and we're facing challenges that we have never faced before in terms of quantity, diversity of drugs that are being pushed into the front lines of the legalization movement. Our main drug challenge is the opioid crisis. I recently rotated off the President's Commission on combating drug addiction and the opioid crisis, and that crisis still flames today. Marijuana, which brings us together to some extent because we're all aware of the consequences of this drug. Hallucinogens are now being touted as medicines, and this is another perfect example of the convergence between medical uses and illicit and recreational uses of drugs. We have new psychoactive substances that are being manufactured in labs, largely in China, but in other nations as well, that are a tremendous threat because there is zero information on their acute or long-term toxicity, and also their ability to go under the radar with regard to drug scheduling, at least temporarily. Methamphetamine and cocaine are raising their heads again. Last year, of 72,000 deaths, 20,000 were attributable primarily to methamphetamine and cocaine. And vaping as a delivery system. And the reason that I am so concerned about vaping is that you can produce pods of any substance whatsoever and deliver very high quantities into the brain. Those in the field know that the faster a drug gets into the brain, the higher the concentration, the more addictive the potential is. And vaping presents an entirely new challenge as a mode of delivery of drugs to the brain. And it has been, for the first time, I think, in decades, that a mode of delivery itself becomes a threat.